themselves, progressive as they may be, will be insufficient if you do not have effective institutions to enforce them. Now, when I say institutions, I don't necessarily mean bureaucracies. You need institutional frameworks which set the rules of the game and which make sure that the signals go out, that there is a penalty to non-compliance just as there is an incentive for compliance. And very often, these institutional rules are market-friendly rules. You can have market-friendly instruments. For example, today the international debate on climate change is on a cap-and-trade system. A cap-and-trade system is a market-friendly system of ensuring that companies perform according to the norms that are set. So when you have institutions, you need rules governing these institutions, but the basic objective will be that the laws that have been passed, the rules that have been promulgated, the standards that have been announced are actually enforced, and that there is an incentive, as I said, for compliance, and there is also a penalty for non-compliance. A third requirement for managing these trade-offs, I think, is complete transparency and accountability on the part of the institutions involved. I think it's very important to send signals of consistency and predictability, although, as I mentioned to you right at the beginning, that there are multiple contradictions in this process, and there is no magic formula that can be followed which says you follow these rules and you then have an effective trade-off between environment and growth. So, in substance, what I would like to convey to you is that India is at a historic turning point. We are at a point in which we are on a high growth trajectory, at least a 7.5 to 8% growth trajectory, a 7.5% growth that we averaged over the last decade, which we hope to improve over the next decade or two. But this growth will of course have to be inclusive to meet social objectives. It will have to be sustainable as well for us to ensure that the growth does not extract an inordinately heavy ecological price, so that we enjoy the fruits of economic growth and the costs of this economic growth are borne by later generations, which I think is goes against the fundamental canons of intergenerational equity. And in this process, I, for one, am convinced that there is an important role for legislation, there is an important role for rules, there is an important role for standards, there's an important role for institutions, and there is an important role for market-friendly modes of intervention as well. So I don't think that we should look at environment as a cost. I don't think we should look at environment as a regulatory burden, but we should look upon it as an essential aspect of economic growth, because without the protection of natural resources, in the long run, economic growth is not going to have much social relevance and meaning as well. Thank you.
Absolutely valid. We need to have enforceable regulatory system if you need to manage the trade-off between growth and environmental protection. But then suppose the laws that you formulate are not as enlightened as you would like them to be. The quality of fuel is responsible 99% for the quality of emissions from a vehicle. But if you don't invest in cleaning up your fuel, but insist on not registering diesel cars, is it going to clean up your environment? Now, how do we ensure that the laws that are passed by the government or sometimes by the courts actually have economic sense rather than respond to a populist appeal?
Well, very often, laws drive technological change. And let me give you the classic example of catalytic converters. Catalytic converters was a consequence of a regulatory requirement imposed by the EPA in the early 80s. There was a lot of protest. Automakers in Detroit protested vociferously against making catalytic converters mandatory. But the EPA went ahead, made the catalytic converters mandatory. That drove technological change, and today most cars across the world are equipped with catalytic converters. I think regulation drives technology. Regulation also creates an environment in which technological change goes forward unimpeded. And there are instances, you have given the example of fuel quality, that you impose a standard and you do not have the fuel which enables you to meet that standard. I think the imposition of a standard drives the investment required for improving the quality of your fuel. And that's what's really happened in the last 10 years. If you see the enormous investments that have been made to improve the quality of fuel used by our vehicles is a response to the standards, the ambient air quality standards that were set. And now, because of the huge concern on pollution, we are now entering a second generation of investment to reduce the sulfur content in our fuel. And the government has announced Bharat Standard 6 by the year 2020. So I think it's important to recognize that regulations are an essential component of driving economic agents along a path that you want them to go. For the last 5 years, for example, we've been having a debate in this country whether we should have mandatory fuel efficiency standards. Finally, that debate was settled a couple of years ago, and mandatory fuel efficiency standards are supposed to kick in for passenger vehicles from the 1st of April 2016. Now, those standards can be improved, no doubt about it. But the fact of the matter is that you need a regulatory system, because the answer to that, not to have a regulatory system, is to self-regulate, is to say we'll allow all people to actually regulate themselves. Unfortunately, the experience of self-regulation in matters like environment, which have externalities, is not very, very positive for us to really expect self-regulation to be a large-scale solution. It may have relevance in specific contexts, but self-regulation can never be an answer to regulation.
Yeah. You said our population is likely to go up by another 40 crore. Yeah? And it won't just increase, it will also urbanize. If, say, 50% of India's population is urban over the next 25, 30 years, if out of 160, half is 80 crore. Current urban population in India is 38 crore. So we will double the number of people living in towns. Can they live in the existing towns? If you build new towns, what is the role of urban planning in ensuring that those towns where additional 40 crore people will live are able to minimize their energy requirements and are more sustainable than our existing towns are? Has government policy ever dwelt upon the role of urban planning in making the economy more energy efficient, in reducing the need for people to spend extra energy?
Well, we've looked traditionally at urbanization as a threat. We have really not looked at urbanization as an opportunity which is going to be inevitable. And you're absolutely right. It's inevitable. Whatever happens, people are going to migrate from rural areas to small towns, from small towns to cities, and from cities to metro. And of the 40 crore increment that we're going to have over the next 30 years, 50 to 60% is really going to be in urban and semi-urban or peri-urban areas. So the planning of infrastructure, particularly energy infrastructure, is going to be absolutely critical. I think one of the things that has happened in the last 5 years, it's remarkable. When I went to Copenhagen Climate Change Conference, solar costs in India were 12 rupees a unit. 3 weeks ago, a big tender was opened in Rajasthan where the solar cost was 4 rupees 50 paise a unit. It's a remarkable situation today where you're seeing nuclear costs go up, you're seeing coal costs go up, and you're seeing solar costs declining. Now, solar is not, I'm not saying it's a panacea, but the fact of the matter is that you have today a major opportunity for redesigning your energy infrastructure in the new towns, in the new areas that you are going to be able to create for absorbing this population. So it may be difficult for you to retrofit Bombay or Calcutta or Chennai or Delhi, but some of the smaller towns which are going to become big towns, or some of the small cities that are going to become big cities, the redesign of the energy infrastructure and the redesign of the public transport system are the two key prerequisites for making this growth sustainable. And I think we can do it because we are at a starting point. We are not late gone into the trajectory. And I think if we can do this in energy and if we can do this in public transport, then we can show some demonstrable successes in terms of sustainable growth. Unfortunately, the good examples of urbanization in India, which took place in the 50s, Chandigarh, Bhubaneswar, Gandhinagar, great cities, well-planned cities, but horribly inefficient from an environmental, energy, and transport point of view. And we'll have to factor that in when you develop your next generation of Chandigarhs, Bhubaneswars, and Gandhinagars.
See, when you discuss public transport, it is, people tend to think in terms of using metros and buses and all that. But what about reducing the requirement for transport in the first place? Now, if you go to the new technology park in Pune, it's some 20 kilometers away from the main city. In the morning, people get up, get dressed, get into their cars, and struggle 3 hours in traffic to reach their destination. At the end of the day, again, the same thing. You come home spending 2 hours in traffic. Why? Why can't we abandon this ridiculous, obsolete concept of town planning where you segregate residential from commercial? Why can't you have residential next to commercial so you can actually walk to work? You reduce the requirement of commutes if you plan your cities and plan your habitats in a way that you are more productive, more efficient, you will spend less time and energy on commutes.
Well, if you're starting afresh, what you are saying is true. But what do you do with the Gurgaon? 250,000 cars go every morning from Delhi to Gurgaon, and 250,000 cars come every day from Gurgaon to Delhi. Now, how do you solve this problem? It's a huge problem. It's a pressure on the energy system. It's a pressure on the road system, and it's a pressure on the air quality. Now, you can't start fresh planning there, but if you're planning a new Gurgaon, certainly already congested places like Gurgaon and all these places, is that you're going to have sharp discontinuities coming in from technology, which is going to change the pattern of transportation. I mean, I am not this is not a commercial for Uber, okay? But I can tell you, Uber, if it works, is going to revolutionize the transportation modes of people. For example, 30 years ago, when I was in government, for 4 years, I was part of a carpooling system. People have forgotten carpooling. But from 1986 to 1990, I came to my office every day in a carpool, went back home every day in a carpool, but then, government abandoned the carpool system for some reason. With Uber-type interventions, or Ola, so that I have a level playing field between Ola and Uber. So both Ola and Uber-type interventions, you are now going to create a situation where technologically it's possible for carpooling to happen. And for places like Gurgaon, for example, there's no reason why carpooling cannot be a viable option for commute every day. But in new places, what you say is absolutely true, that you don't really need to commute long distances. You can reduce the distance you can reduce the transportation load by redesigning and allowing residential and commercial activities in the same zone.
Let me shift to a different locus of this issue. This is about democracy. You said a large number of people in this country still rely on struggle for access to water, clean air, land, and forest resources. Now, the issue is, for a country like India to develop, you need to develop its mineral resources. And many of the mineral resources lie buried deep inside forests that you ideally would not like to destroy. But you need to tap them. In that process, you might also dislodge tribal communities who have lived there for generations, who have a particular way of life beyond which they know nothing. Now, how do you ensure these communities are able to live a decent life with dignity, and still you are able to access the minerals that the economy so desperately needs?
Well, this is a political dynamite of a question. And, the question that I have to confront in the context of coal, Minister. And the coal minister, the coal